Hello, friends. Such a pleasure to greet so many of you in this invisible manner around the world, and appreciate so much the kind comments that you've been sending. Most encouraging in our little encounter here to read the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and we're kind of starting at the very beginning of it all. I mean, with the summary statements that he's made, where he defines the central figures of the faith, where he defines the different ages and eras and epochs of the cause, as we mentioned previously. Friends, the Guardians stands as a kind of focal point where all of the powers of the revelation descend through him. You know, there's a marvelous section in God Passes By. I don't know if I got it right here. See if I can find it. Sorry, just a delay here. This is on page 244 of God Passes By. I just mention this because it has a bearing on our relationship with the Guardian now. Here we have Shoghi Effendi describing what happened with the passing of Baha'u'llah with respect to his relationship to all of us here on earth, still in mortal flesh, so to speak. It says Baha'u'llah's stupendous task on this earthly plane had moreover at the time of his passing been brought to its final consummation. His mission, far from being in any way inconclusive, had in every respect been carried through to a full end. The message with which he had been entrusted had been disclosed to the gaze of all mankind. Just prior to that, we, of course, had this, the world suffered this removal of the manifestation of God with his passing. Shoghi Effendi says, yet as the appointed center of Baha'u'llah's covenant and the authorized interpreter of his teaching had himself later explained, the dissolution of the tabernacle, wherein the soul of the manifestation of God had chosen temporarily to abide, signalized its release from the restrictions which an earthly life had of necessity imposed upon it. Look, here we have the manifestation choosing where he's going to appear and in whom he's going to appear. Then, having been removed from earthly life, the restrictions are also lessened. And Abdu'l-Baha says, this is for the soul. Its influence no longer circumscribed by any physical limitations. Its radiance no longer beclouded by its human temple. That soul could henceforth energize the whole world to a degree unapproached at any stage in the course of its existence on this planet. Look here now, we see this influence of the manifestation of God tremendously enhanced by his passing. How would this not have a parallel with the passing of the guardian of the cause of God, the sign of God on earth, how would he not have become more intimately connected with us, channeling the truths that he had derived from the revelation, providing us with the focus and understanding of the revelation, which frankly is beyond the concept of any of us. Thank goodness he harvested a vision, a clear vision of the future, a vision of the essential verities of the cause. This is a gift which he's given us, and he continues to animate us when we approach his writings in the right spirit. And they fill us with hope. They fill us with the immensity and grandeur of the cause. We're going to talk about that a bit in a subsequent class. Right now, we're trying in the course of these examinations that we're making of these initial writings of Shoghi Effendi, we're trying to renew, if you will, or I'm suggesting that we try to renew the grid on which everything hangs in the cause, the history of the cause. By having divided Baha'i history not only into the Adamic cycle and then the Baha'i cycle, but into the 3 ages of the Baha'i dispensation, of the Baha'i era. He's given us a place where we can connect, where we can hang, if you will, the additional stories and anecdotes and startling guidance that we find in the writings, throughout the writings. We have some place to hang it. We see what period it's in. We see how it's come to us. We see its level of authority in controlling our thoughts and inspiration. This is such a gift that it doesn't get repeated. I mean, this is come, we have it in his writings. Think of Shoghi Effendi having to contemplate how to take this, I think clear enough to us, this immature Baha'i world and educate it. He schooled us through the progressive writings that he released to the Baha'i world, his messages and his guidance. He brought us forward, and each time he stepped to another degree, the vision was more grand. He gave us more of it, so to speak. There's no way to. The celebration of this is by reviewing and looking at it, going at it over and over. I remember we had a Baha'i who was grounding me in the face. She was an auxiliary board member in the World Crusade when the board members were few and far between, and they were appointed and directed by the hands of the cause of God. And she said, you know, I would urge you to study the dispensation of Baha'u'llah once every 6 months. Because you're changing all the time. It's not changing, but you're changing, and you will perceive new insights. It's just, the whole thing is churning with truths and revelatory dimensions and the beauty of the cause and what's unfolding. So last week we had a document up on the screen which we hadn't finished looking at. Let's see, I've got to go here and bring that up. Thursday class materials, maybe that'll give us. Share screen. That's that one. What do we work? Where do we have this?
So first double click this. Double click.
There we go. Can you see that, friends? I hope so. So I have suggested that we begin by examining the way Shoghi Effendi describes the three central figures of the faith, and how clear he was that there were only three central figures of the faith. The guardian is not a fourth central figure of the faith. He himself said he's one of the two sustaining pillars of the administrative order. But the three central figures in themselves have a unique position in the history of the cause. And we said that he is the first of the three central figures is the Bab. And I think maybe, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I was pointing out that probably these 4 points here, that he was a youth, a native of Shiraz, that his name was Mirza Ali Muhammad, and he was known as the Bab, so that you don't say his name was the Bab, because it wasn't. And that he was 25, and he advanced the claim of being the herald of the cause. And then there's these subpoints that, I'm broken all this down at my own initiative. It may not line up the way you would see it broken down, but the point of it is it helps us to take note of each of the points that Shoghi Effendi is setting forth. It helps us to unpack the immensity of what he's put in every sentence. So here we have, he's described the Bab in those terms. We've already looked at the qualities of the three central figures that are derived from the statement to the committee, the UN committee, in the first place. And in the second, the qualities that are mentioned in the foreword to God Passes By, when Shoghi Effendi reviews the 4 periods of the first Baha'i century. So we want to see that it was May 1844, and doesn't make a point of saying the day here. At the age of 25, he advanced the claim of being the herald. And the herald what? The one that, according to the sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself. So one of the aspects of the Bab's mission that we want to hold in our awareness and consciousness is that the herald announces the new day. But then in the course of his ministry, he prepares the way for the advent of the one that was greater than himself, who was to come. And this one who's greater than himself has his own mission, which would be according to those same scriptures that he refers to of the previous dispensations, to inaugurate an era of, what kind of an era is it? An era of righteousness and peace. An era that would be hailed as the consummation of all previous dispensations, and initiate a new cycle in the religious history of mankind. So we see the Bab is standing at the confluence of 2 universal religious cycles, the Adamic cycle and the Baha'i cycle. And his ministry, Shoghi Effendi clearly establishes as an essential part of the Baha'i dispensation. So the inauguration of the faith, it begins in 1844 with the declaration of the Bab. We talked a little bit last week about this new cycle in the religious history of mankind. This is the Baha'i cycle. someone has asked, I mentioned that the Adamic cycle is part of this new cycle. Shoghi Effendi says that the new cycle encompasses it, and I suggested that you look at the chapter on universal cycles in some answered questions, Abdu'l-Baha's explanation. Then, having established this, what he was about, what he's come for, he describes what happens to him. And these are very interesting. I mean, out of all the things that one could say about that or you've read in Dawnbreakers or somewhere else or in the history of the cause, this is what happened. Swift and severe persecution launched by the organized forces of church and state in his native land. And they precipitated, in this order, his arrest, his exile to the mountains of Azerbaijan, his imprisonment in the fortresses of Maku and Cherik, and finally his execution in July 1850 by a firing squad in the public square of Tabriz. What could be easier, friends, if we're supposed to please describe what happened in the ministry of the Bab? Here we have it, reduced to its simplest but most forthcoming analysis of what are the points that should be there and what are the points that are missing and don't need to be there. By our concentrating and thinking about these things a bit, if we can make them our own, it makes it a whole lot easier to talk about initially in settings with the seekers, to talk about the nature of the Bab, his ministry, his mission, what was it for, and what was the outcome? What did that ministry precipitate? Arrest, exile, imprisonment, execution. Arrest, exile, imprisonment, execution. No less than 20,000 of his followers were put to death with such barbarous cruelty as to evoke the warm sympathy and the unqualified admiration of a number of Western writers, diplomats, travelers, and scholars, some of whom were witnesses of these abominable outrages and were moved to record them in their books and diaries. Shoghi Effendi has drawn liberally from these testimonies in the footnotes that he's added to the Dawnbreakers with his editing and translating of Nabil's narrative. He's added these admiration and qualifications, different things that are found in the writings of these diplomats, travelers, and scholars. Diplomats, travelers, and scholars. Another three, the things you want to remember, that there were Western writers there who expressed sympathy and unqualified admiration for what was happening. This becomes I think, very helpful to Westerners first hearing about the faith. It's not something, a fairy tale made up in Iran that we don't have any justification for. Now, moving on to the second of the three central figures when considered in their historic order, Mirza Hossein Ali, surnamed Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. And here are the points that Shoghi Effendi singles out with respect to the person of Baha'u'llah. He whose advent the Bab had foretold. So it's made clear. We believe that Baha'u'llah was the fulfillment of the prophecies of the Bab. And Baha'u'llah was assailed by those same forces of ignorance and fanaticism church and state we saw previous, organized, fully organized. He was imprisoned in Tehran, was banished in 1852 from his native land to Baghdad and thence to Constantinople and Adrianople, and finally to the prison city of Akka. That's a 4-stage exile from Tehran to Baghdad, Baghdad to Constantinople, Constantinople to Adrianople, Adrianople to the Holy Land, to the prison city of Akka. And he remained incarcerated for no less than 24 years. This is an important number too you want to remember. Do you know how long was Baha'u'llah imprisoned in the Holy Land? And in whose neighborhood he passed away in 1892. He remained a prisoner the whole time, but he was able to live outside of the fortress itself in the latter years. So this gives us a little picture of the movements related to Baha'u'llah, who he was, and where he spent the time of his ministry. Now we come here to that in the course of his banishment, particularly in Adrianople and Akka, Baha'u'llah formulated the laws and ordinances of his dispensation. He expounded in over 100 volumes the principles of his faith, proclaimed his message to the kings and rulers of both the East and the West. Before we move on here, this 100 volumes is quite interesting too. The 100 volumes, they're not 100 volumes with the names, different titles of books. They're 100 volumes of leather-bound notebooks in which Zainul Muqarrabin has copied down the numerous tablets flowing from Baha'u'llah's pen. And those numerous tablets, many of which don't have any title, they constitute the content of these 100 volumes. And then notice he says expounded in these so many volumes the principles of his faith. Abdul-Baha has chosen certain principles to emphasize in his Western travels. We have mistakenly called them usually the 12 principles of the Baha'i faith. Shoghi Effendi, as we saw previously, has outlined the principles that Abdul-Baha proclaimed in the West, saying that they all revolve around the central principle of the oneness and wholeness of humankind. But there are many more principles that we want to go on discovering, and certainly Shoghi Effendi, in the course of God Passes By, raises a number of them, brings them to our attention. So he's formulated laws and ordinances, he's expounded the principles, and he's proclaimed his message to the kings and rulers of both East and West. Then he said they were both Christian and Muslim. He addressed the Pope, the Caliph of Islam, the chief magistrates of the republics of the American continent, that includes Latin America, friends, as confirmed in his own messages. He addresses the entire Christian sacerdotal order. He addresses the leaders of both Shia and Sunni Islam and the high priests of the Zoroastrian religion. Well, when we say Baha'u'llah proclaimed his message, he says in the course of his banishment, particularly Adrianople and Akka, the main body of the message, the Surah Muluk, and all those major tablets, number of major tablets, was sent from Adrianople, proclaimed from Adrianople. And Shoghi Effendi mentions that this proclamation of Baha'u'llah's message was the zenith of his ministry. Then there's the sequel to the proclamation. Shoghi Effendi calls it the sequel in Akka, in which Baha'u'llah, in the Most Holy Book and other tablets, addressed, in this case, to a number of individual kings and rulers as well, constitutes another phase of this proclamation. Now, look, you see, in these writings, what has he done in these writings? What was the very character, if you will, of his proclamation? He proclaimed his revelation, his position as the manifestation of God for this day. He summoned those whom he addressed to heed his call and espouse his faith. He warned them of the consequences of their refusal and denounced, in some cases, their arrogance and tyranny. Very bold proclamation, if you will. So we have in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, he talks about these stages of the coming of the Son of Truth. It dawns the early morning light of the Bab in Shiraz, and then the initial stages of Baha'u'llah's ministry when he received the revelation in the Seyyid Chal in Tehran, in the underground subterranean dungeon. And for the first time in religious history, we have the manifestation of God describing to us the process of his annunciation, of his appointment as the revelator, as the message of God for this day. So we've never had anything like that before, certainly not with the authority of revealed text. Then we come to the third of the central figures, Abbas Effendi, known as Abdul Baha, the servant of Baha. First important thing to know that he has been appointed by Baha'u'llah as his lawful successor, as well as the authorized interpreter of his teachings. And of course, if you go to the Kitab-i Aqdas, you'll see the source of those statements. Then Shoghi Effendi adds on something of the nature of the ministry that he had. Since early childhood, he'd been closely associated with his father. He'd shared his exile and tribulations. He remained a prisoner until 1908, when as a result of the Young Turk Revolution, he was released from his confinement, as were all political and religious prisoners. After having been released, he established his residence in Haifa. And he soon after that embarked on his 3-year journey to Egypt, Europe, and North America, in the course of which he expounded before vast audiences the teachings of his father. 2 things he says about it: expounded the teachings and predicted the approach of that catastrophe that was soon to befall mankind. Now, this catastrophe, Shoghi Effendi has told us, is passing through various stages, but the first very strong development of it, of course, was the First World War. After this, his residence in the West, his travels, he returned to his home on the eve of the First World War, in the course of which he himself was exposed to constant danger until the liberation of Palestine by the forces under the command of General Allenby, who extended the utmost consideration to him and to the small band of his fellow exiles in Akka and Haifa. Moving on, then Shoghi Effendi described the end of Abdu'l-Baha's ministry. He says in 1921 he passed away and was buried in a vault in the mausoleum erected on Mount Carmel at the express instruction of Baha'u'llah for the remains of the Bab, which had previously been transferred from Tabriz to the Holy Land after having been preserved and concealed for no less than 60 years. That's a miraculous story that's been told in 3 very important books in the last couple of years, with all fullness of detail. You want to take a look at that? Okay, let's see now. We are screen sharing. We're going to stop the sharing of that particular document. And we want to look next at this Baha'i history and overview. Can you see that, friends? I hope so. So now we're pulling back and taking a bigger view. We looked at the ministries of the 3 central figures of the faith. We looked at the characterizations of how you could describe what they were like. And now Shoghi Effendi has also provided an overview of the whole first Baha'i century, the first century of the Baha'i era, 1844 to 1944. Look how he describes this to us. He said, in its broadest outline, the first century of the Baha'i era may be said to comprise the heroic, and then he gives alternate titles to that age, the heroic, the primitive, the apostolic age of the faith of Baha'u'llah. And you want to be sure you see this 3 names that you fix in your mind, that the heroic age, generally called the heroic age, is also the primitive age, the apostolic age of the faith. And this first Baha'i century also involves the initial stages of the formative, the transitional, the iron age of the cause of Baha'u'llah. So we've got the heroic age, which is also called primitive and apostolic, and then we have the formative age, which is also called the transitional or iron age. And then Shoghi Effendi very simply describes an extraordinary process which is going to take place. It's destined to witness the crystallization and shaping of the creative energies released by the revelation itself. Crystallization, think of that, out of the murk of a substance about to crystallize, it has inherent in it shapes and forms. And the creative energies are stirring, and then they start crystallizing. They start crystallizing into the visible agencies of the administrative order of Baha'u'llah. There's no disconnect between the creative energies and their output, their incarnation, if you will, their crystallization during the formative transitional iron age, in which we are still passing new aspects and dimensions of the outcome of the output of these divine creative energies can be witnessed in all of the developments of the cause. He returns us, he says there, the first 80 years of this century may be roughly said to have covered the entire period of the first age. which is that, the heroic age, the primitive age, the apostolic age, while the last 2 decades may be regarded as having witnessed the beginnings of the second or transitional, a formative transitional Iron Age of the cause. The former, the heroic age of the faith, commences with the declaration of the Bab, includes the mission of Baha'u'llah, and terminates with the passing of Abdul-Baha. First 80 years of that first Baha'i century. The latter, the formative age, again, is ushered in by Abdul-Baha's will and testament, which defines its character and establishes its foundation. Abdul-Baha, friends, is the architect of the administrative order, Shoghi Effendi tells us. Very important to understand that. The creative forces released during the heroic, primitive, and apostolic age had to be gradually contracted and mustered for the accomplishment of the purposes of the formative age of the faith. And these have been defined in the Will and Testament, the character of this age and its foundation, which are all the institutions that are mentioned there, the guardianship and the national spiritual assemblies and the elaboration of the Universal House of Justice, which has been mentioned by Baha'u'llah clearly in his writings with a number of points, but no indication is given about how it might come into being or who would appoint it. That was all left by Baha'u'llah to be supplemented by the Master in his Will and Testament. And it's the Will and Testament that talks about the secondary houses of justice, the national, at present time understood to be the national spiritual assemblies, fact, of course, which he confirms, who have been called upon in the will to elect the Universal House of Justice. Now, the House of Justice itself, when it came into being, it's able to enact and define things that are not clearly established in the writings of the central figures of the faith. And so it's the House of Justice itself which has, in its constitution, established that it's to be an elected body, elected every 5 years. Now, since the statements and enactments of the House of Justice, as stated clearly in the writings, are not of the same character as the divine revelation, as the text itself, which cannot be altered, the House of Justice is able to look at what it's doing, review it, and modify the enactments that it's made, which is a terrific advantage to the cause because it gives the flexibility to adapt the growth and development of the cause to the different stages in the unfoldment of mankind's history under the influence of these terrific creative energies which were released in the heroic age of the faith. Now, and I've broken this down, I've separated the sentences so we can take more careful look at them. But you can see all this in the original, in the foreword to God Passes By. Remember, that's 1944. The century under our review may therefore be considered as falling into 4 distinct periods. And here he introduces this new word of times as periods of unequal duration, each of specific import and of tremendous and indeed unappraisable significance. This first Baha'i century is extraordinary things that have all happened. These four periods are closely interrelated and constitute successive acts of one indivisible, stupendous, and sublime drama, whose mystery no intellect can fathom, whose climax no eye can even dimly perceive. This is all coming in the future in the golden age of the cause, the third of the three ages of the Baha'i era, and whose conclusion no mind can adequately foreshadow. Shoghi Effendi gives some hint about the nature of the future of the cause, its unfoldment, the stages ahead in his writings. But he says no one can do this clearly. I mean, obviously he had the capacity to see much further than we could see. Now he talks about these periods. Each of these acts revolves around its own theme, all right? Boasts its own heroes, registers its own tragedies, records its own triumphs, and contributes its own share to the execution of one common, immutable purpose. Here we have the eye of the guardian, focusing on and absorbing the whole vision of the first Baha'i century. Now, Shoghi Effendi tells us to isolate any one of them from the others, to dissociate the latter manifestations of one universal, all-embracing revelation from the pristine purpose that animated it in its earliest days, would be tantamount to a mutilation of the structure on which it rests, and to a lamentable perversion of its truth and of its history. Now, along the route in the development of the cause, there have been people who've tried to read the ministries of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha separately from each other, and then tried to discern from how they made those after their own understanding of what had happened previously. This is something that's always ended up as a disaster. I mean, there were those that said, okay, the Bab, if you can find documents of the Bab, which suggest that he didn't, or it is suggested by Baha'i scholars that he didn't at first clearly state he was a manifestation of God, and certainly that he said he was the gate of the Qaim, but not the Qaim himself. Then we find now writings decades later in which the Bab says, as a consolation to the challenge of the coming of the Qaim, I did not clearly manifest all the nature of my revelation when I appeared. It's only after his arriving in Maku where he began to be with the revelation of the Persian Bayan and the Arabic Bayan made it clear what his role was. But you look at the opening chapter of the Qayyum al-Asma and you see that the Bab has proclaimed everything there. And I don't think it was missed by the clergy, by the Shia hierarchy, when copies of the text of the Qayyum al-Asma were distributed or shared. So someone, excuse me, just an interruption here we have in the comments. A question, is there an order in which Baha'is should read the writings? Example, the Igan, the Aktas, 4 valleys, 7 valleys, etc. there's no established order in which to read them. One could read them chronologically, one could read them hierarchically, and one should do all of that, you know? It shouldn't just be the one way or the other. I know in my own Baha'i studies over the years, not that that's any big example, but I began reading quickly the major writings. And actually, I was able to approach the writings of Baha'u'llah, which are the ones he's mentioning here, through the summaries of Shoghi Effendi. He summarizes the content of the Yugan in God Passes By. He summarizes the content of the Akdas in God Passes By. He points to the essential nature of Seven Valleys as the most outstanding of Baha'u'llah's mystical compositions. He establishes the immortal importance of the hidden words of Baha'u'llah as a guide to virtues, an ethical work. He calls it the essential ethical work of Baha'u'llah. We think of hidden words, I think, oftentimes as being very mystical. Certainly it has mystical aspects, but its ethical content, its pattern as a model for Baha'i conduct, for Baha'i thinking, for Baha'i vision, as Abdu'l-Baha calls it. These words have not been revealed to be read, he said, but to be lived. So there's not really an affirmative answer there, but I think that you can approach these works that are mentioned here of Baha'u'llah through checking to see how the Guardian describes them and how he balances them with each other. It's a picture, if you will, of relationship between these essential writings. The Yugan, you know, Baha'u'llah has written it as a babi, and it's his defense of the Bab's revelation. Returning again back to the fact that we have to view all of the developments of the cause with an understanding of what came before and how it's the continuity of that. And we have elements in now, and of course in our institute courses, which have separated these things in a way of viewing them in their own special way. But they also, the institute course stresses the need to go back to the original writings and read them for ourselves. We have collective activities in the cause, of which the institute course is the principal one. But then we have the call of Baha'u'llah and the Master and the Guardian to undertake a study of the sacred writings for ourselves and to draw our own conclusions and understanding of the revelation. So important, friends. Then dynamized and filled with the light, the splendors of the revelation and of what it taught us, we bring our refined, purified self, so to speak, to the collective activities of the cause and give them a special animation. I think it's a mistake if we look for our inspiration as Baha'is deriving from our collective activities in the cause. Certainly they can be a source of animation and stimulation, but not one that in any way replaces our relationship with the sacred texts, the words of revelation issued from the Bab and Baha'u'llah and interpreted by Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi. we have a huge task. The Baha'is are busy, I mentioned last week. It's also to study and to teach. These are the two main activities of our individual Baha'i life, so to speak. Now I want to go to another document that's here. 4 periods. Here we are. Can you see that? I hope you can all see that. We have a question about what is the significance of the use of the term Iron Age? Are we to draw a comparison between the 3 notional stages of history, the Neolithic, the Bronze, and ultimately the Iron Age? I haven't seen any confirmation of that. I've usually thought of the Iron Age as just a further elaboration on the primitive stage. Not entirely defined. It gets defined as we move along, and we have these interpretations of Abdu'l-Baha and Baha'u'llah, and Shoghi Effendi. All right, friends, now this is another take, this one now from the Forward to God Passes By. That's where this document you have before you on the screen. And this is where these 4 periods that we just read about that are, you can't separate them from each other. You can't outline forces outside of them that determine them or change them. It all is still coming from the same source. It's the crystallization. It's the revelatory foundation of the cause of God, which gradually appears in the form of organized institutions. The administrative order of the faith is the incarnation of these divine energies. Now, it's so important for us to study these original texts so that we're animated. The gifts that we've been given are animated and activated by our interaction with the divine verses. We're standing, as I understand it, friends, we're standing, moving up in our lives, hopefully, with 2 influences. On the one hand, we have the revelation and the inspiration and the confirmation of the concourse on high and those angelic elements that channel to us the influence of the revelation. They bring to bear on us as we read the verses of God that it attracts enables them, if you will, to animate our inner beings to see the meanings of the revelation in accord with the gifts and treasures, unique gifts and treasures, which each of us has revealed, has received, and is maintained in us by the manifestation of God himself. So this repeats a bit of we had in the previous document, that the first period centers around the gentle, youthful, and irresistible person of the Bab. Again, this is not broken down as much, but I hope you'll reflect on each of these points, because this is the way we clarify our understanding of the cause, our vision of the faith. Matchless in his meekness, my goodness. Where do we get that impression? How can we find the Dawnbreaker stories that help us understand that? His serenity, the magnetic character of his utterance, and then these dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry, which are unrivaled in the history of the first Baha'i century. going on to declare, all right, what is this first period? What does it consist of? We had that other image in the previous document. This one says it begins with the declaration of his mission, culminates in his martyrdom, and ends in a veritable orgy of religious massacre, revolting in its hideousness. And then now this is all the outer history of the faith, not just the nature of the revelation, the revelatory process. The outer history is characterized by 9 years of fierce and relentless contest, whose theater was the whole of Persia, in which above 10,000 heroes laid down their lives, in which 2 sovereigns of the Qajar dynasty and their wicked ministers participated, and which was supported by the entire Shia ecclesiastical hierarchy, by the military resources of the state, and by the implacable hostility of the masses. Friends, you know, you're thinking about it, reading the Dawnbreakers and reading the history in God Passes By, one wonders, you know, how the coming of the Bab shook the entire nation. I think everyone was, just as we're living now in a period where we all want to know the rumors and everything about the coronavirus and so on, they were hearing hints and allusions to the miraculous character of this claimant to divine revelation after Muhammad, which was already a startling development. But then they heard these marvelous stories of conversion and the way that these thousands of heroes offered up their lives in complete detachment, in ecstasy with having embraced the new revelation of God. Amazing period in history. And we look at the way Shoghi Effendi summarizes this, because he had to summarize in God Passes By. Very important. The hints of all the things that you want to explore in associated writings are found in those first 5 chapters of God Passes By. Now, the second period. The second period derives its inspiration from the august figure of Baha'u'llah, preeminent in holiness, awesome in the majesty of his strength and power, and unapproachable in the transcendent brightness of his glory. Pretty hard to get a clear picture of Baha'u'llah. We're amazed as we read stories and anecdotes about what it was like to be in his presence. Friends, when I was in the Holy Land, I heard their, accounts of how the friends were in Baha'u'llah's presence. And invited, they came to Baha'u'llah, and he spoke to them. He quoted from his writings to them, told them stories, cited his own teachings to them. But there would be moments in which he would oftentimes thank them and dismiss them from his presence rather abruptly. And the friends pondered what was the meaning of that until those who were more familiar with the situation realized that revelation came on Baha'u'llah without being called. He wasn't just a revealer just anytime he wanted to reveal. He was called to come to dictate the revelation that was being communicated to him. And so he'd have to meet with his secretary, and very few times anyone was in the presence of Baha'u'llah when he was revealing, except Aga John and a few of the other secretaries and the master himself. It was so overwhelming that people couldn't keep their equilibrium if they heard him, they heard the verses as they were revealed, as he chanted them, as they came from the inner realms of sanctity. So mysterious, friends. This divine, invisible realm channels these divine energies into the messenger of God, and he converts them in his spirit into verses that are understandable to us and basically now have been reduced from divine forces and energies in the other realm into an outer form that's material in character. First of all, from the spirit of Baha'u'llah receiving it, they are transmitted into sound waves, the sound of his voice, and they're cast into terms of understandable speech or preeminent speech, if you will. And the secretary is busy transmitting them into an even more material form, and that is the ink of the pen that he's noting down the dictation he's receiving as Baha'u'llah receives it. Then later Baha'u'llah would sit with the secretaries and ask them what they had written down, and then he'd supplement it, he'd add the missing words. Aga John said basically, there was one place where he testified, he said, I could usually get down one in every 5 of the verses Baha'u'llah. They were so rapid, the descent of revelation through Baha'u'llah. And he would shine like the sun, he said. It was so powerful as he was revealing. Impossible to, unbearable to look at him. He was so, there was such power there. And that was why, as a kindness to the friends, he didn't reveal in their presence the transcendent, unapproachable in the transcendent brightness of his glory. I know we're over the time. Maybe I'll take a few more minutes just to look at this 2 other paragraphs that are here. It opens this second period, which is the ministry of Baha'u'llah. It opens with the first stirrings in the soul of Baha'u'llah while in the Siyat of Tehran of the revelation anticipated by the Bab. Attains its plenitude in the proclamation of that revelation to the kings and ecclesiastical leaders of the earth, and terminates in the ascension of its author in the vicinity of the prison town of Akka. So here we have the stages of revelation itself, the dawning of the Sun of Truth, its morning splendor, which takes place in Baghdad, its birth in the Siyad Child of Tehran, then that would be like the daybreak, and then mid-morning is all of these immortal works of Baha'u'llah revealed in Baghdad. And then we move to the zenith, the top revelation in the proclamation to the kings and rulers that took place initially in Adrianople. And finally to the continuing splendors of his revelation once in Akka with the revealing of the most holy book and those majestic tablets which we see constitute the sequel, if you will, the continuation of his revelation in the holy city of the prison town of Akka. It extends over 39 years of continuous, look at these words here, continuous, unprecedented, and overpowering revelation. What was the revelation like of Baha'u'llah during these 39 years? How does he characterize it? Continuous, unprecedented, and overpowering. marked by the propagation of the faith to the neighboring territories. This is the spread of its light. Turkey, Russia, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and India. And distinguished by a corresponding aggravation of hostility. The growth and proclamation of the cause brought attacks on, represented by the united attacks launched by the Shah of Persia and the Sultan of Turkey, the two admittedly most powerful potentates of the East, as well as by the opposition of the twin sacerdotal orders of Shia and Sunni Islam. Well, that kind of brings us to the end of our time this morning. I'm so happy to have spent the time, and it gives me the opportunity to review these wonderful words of the Guardian and try to derive fresh inspiration from his characterization of these periods, his characterization of the different stages of what's going on. This is the first time I picked up on this. I mean, I've seen it over and over, but I'd never picked it out. Continuous, unprecedented, overpowering revelation as a description of the revelation during Baha'u'llah's ministries. Terrific things to discover. Now, next week, we'll come back and look at the ministry here, the overview of the ministry, the third period Shoghi Effendi is describing of Abdu'l-Baha's ministry. And then we'll look at these, a bit at these early stages, the first period of the administrative order as it unfolds under the guidance and stimulus of Shoghi Effendi. This is an exciting adventure. It should fill us consistently with fresh vision and hope. The revelation has come, it is acting on mankind, and that's part of what we're going to examine next week. What have been the effects of the revelation so far, and what vision of the future has Shoghi Effendi left us with. So I wish you a very happy end of the week, and we'll be back with you, God willing, next Thursday. Thank you.